Today on Upfront, my in-depth interview with Governor Scott Walker, his first Upfront appearance in 2014. Next, the governor on the state of his race. Does he think the contest with Democrat Mary Burke is a dead heat? Plus, the John Doe investigation. Are his lawyers really trying to settle with prosecutors? And his promise of 250,000 jobs in his first term. Why is Wisconsin creating jobs at a pace slower than he expected?
Covering the issues important to Wisconsin. This is Up Front with Mike Goucher.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Up Front. Our guest today is Republican Governor Scott Walker, who is here for the first time since declaring his bid for re-election in April. The latest Marquette University Law School poll showed the governor tied among registered voters with his likely Democratic opponent, former Trek Bicycle executive Mary Burke. He held a small lead among likely voters. We're talking about all of this and more today with Governor Walker, and welcome back to the program, Governor.
Great to be with you, Mike. Thanks for being on.
We'll talk campaign, and we'll talk the issues in the campaign in just a moment, but I want to spend a couple of minutes on the John Doe, because as we know from court records, the latest phase of this appears to be focused on whether or not your campaign coordinated with conservative groups. Those conservative groups are challenging it in court. Last week, middle of the week, kind of a surprising development, an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, and it was a pretty tough editorial, and I'm going to read a bit of it and have you respond to it. It says, we've learned that Stephen Biskupic, who represents Friends of Scott Walker, your campaign committee, has been negotiating with Wisconsin Special Prosecutor Francis Schmitz to settle the state's investigation, the John Doe investigation. The understandable concern of the targets of the John Doe is that Mr. Biskupic will cut a deal that will exonerate Mr. Walker while wresting concessions from some of Mr. Walker's allies. The editorial goes on to say, sounds like Mr. Walker has to decide whose side he's on, his own or the larger principles he claims to represent. So a couple of questions. Number one, has an attorney representing you in the campaign committee been negotiating with Francis Schmitz to settle this case?
Well, as you know, as I pointed out many times in the past when we talked about this, the law is pretty clear in this state. Anyone who knows anything about a John Doe can't talk about it. Anyone who doesn't know anything about it shouldn't talk about it. So I've not commented on the Doe itself because I've abided by the law. We pointed out last week, our campaign put out a clear statement that per the lawsuit, which is up until now largely been the focal point of the court and even of the media, is neither I nor my campaign is a party to that, so we can't settle. We can't be a part of a deal. And I think in the larger context, when I saw that editorial, the one other part that I guess concerns me is I think my track record here and across the country is pretty clear. I'm an economic and fiscal conservative. Obviously, over the last few years, I've shown it that I've committed to those principles, even in the face of extreme outside pressure. And it just surprises me that anyone would think that in any way I would undermine anyone who shared those same principles. Clearly, I would not.
You said that your campaign issued a clear statement on Thursday, but the statement talked about the federal lawsuit. It didn't mention the state investigation. Right. Would it not be possible people to infer that because there was no mention, the state, that there may be these negotiations taking place?
No, it would be per the point I mentioned initially, which is the state law is pretty clear. Even though there might be others who don't follow that law, regardless of the purpose is, if someone knows about a John Doe investigation of any sort, not just on this issue, by law they're prohibited from talking about it. If they don't know, as I've said repeatedly, people who don't know shouldn't be talking about it. So we haven't commented on that. What we talked about is what is legally within the purview of what we can. We point out the obvious fact that in terms of a settlement or a deal that would involve the people who filed that federal lawsuit, we're not party to it. We can't be a part of that.
Couldn't you have said we're not talking about this on a state level either, just as you did with the federal lawsuit, that we can't cut a deal because of that?
Well, but again, on that point, if anyone who's commenting on that is, again, going astray of what the law is in the state. What I made clear when the larger context I just mentioned about the editorial is I think my record's pretty clear. I have stood firm on conservative principles, particularly economic and fiscal principles of fighting for budget reform and fiscal sanity.
You were surprised by this editorial, weren't you? I mean, this is a newspaper that supported just about everything you've done.
Yeah.
And they seem to imply that if you do something for political reasons, there will be political consequences for you. Is that an incorrect reading of it?
Well, I don't know what their premise is, and I don't know where they're getting information from. I just know the bottom line is my record's been very clear, even outside of this issue, that I stand firm on my principles, and I certainly stand firm with the people who share those principles. And I think anyone who suggests otherwise is really mistaken.
Nobody's being thrown under the bus.
Nope.
No. Let's talk about the state of the campaign. You've seen some of the recent polls. They show it to be a very close race between you and the likely Democratic challenger, Mary Burke. Do you see it that way? Do you see it as a horse race at this moment in time?
I said it. You know, remember when Charles Franklin put out the last poll that showed the Marquette poll, a little bit of a gap. We said at the time we expected it would tighten up, so our prediction is exactly right. Remember, I'm probably one of the few governors in American history, at least in recent history, that sustained almost 3 years of nearly constant attack, much of it funded by outside groups like the big government unions out there. This is a state that's been divided politically long before I was governor. In 2000 and 2004, Wisconsin was the closest blue state in America in the presidential election. So we always thought this would be a close election, particularly with some of the external forces coming in. What I'm excited about, that poll showed it, is that amongst independents, I still have a significant advantage there. And I think independents, certainly the base is going to drive turnout. That'll be a key part. But the other key part to winning in November is going to be independents. And I think when independents look at the difference, I mean, we've consistently, during my tenure, seen unemployment go down. It's 5.8%, the lowest it's been in more than 5 years. It's well below the national average. If they compare that to the track record of my opponent, Madison School Board member Mary Burke, remember, the only time in the last 25 years that unemployment has actually been higher, worse off in Wisconsin than it was in the nation, was when she was working for Jim Doyle as the Secretary of Commerce in charge of jobs. So when people start to look, I don't think most people know that. When they look at that difference, I think independents are going to come our way.
You mentioned, why wouldn't an independent have a different reaction? You promised 250,000 jobs. It appears that you will fall significantly short of that. Why would it not make common sense for an independent to say, you know what, I believed in that guy, he promised 250,000 jobs, and he didn't deliver. Because I'm going to try somebody different.
No, he's legitimate, but here's the difference. I think independents are pretty smart in this state. They look at the full record of things. I know they're going to punish us for having a big, bold, aggressive record. I think a lot of independent-minded voters in this state are going to ask, am I better off today than I was 4 years ago? And under every measure, just about every measure out there, more jobs, more businesses, lower unemployment, more people in the workforce, graduation rates up, budget deficit gone, replaced by a surplus, to $2 billion of tax relief, property taxes lower this year. You look at all those measures, it is better off today than it was before. Now, it can be much better, but the question an independent voter, I think, is going to have to ask, and I think they are asking right now, is not only are they better off, but which is the right way to go forward? Is it to continue with these positive reforms that have gotten us better than we were 4 years ago? Or is it to go back to the policies that not only Jim Doyle embraced, but that Mary Burke was a part of, that got us the budget deficit, that got us 130,000 plus jobs lost, 27,000 businesses lost? That's the real contrast.
Would you not concede, though, that that was a national recession, that there were many states that were bleeding jobs, just as Wisconsin was?
Well, except that those policies we see happening right now in real time just to the south of us in Springfield. So I think if voters say we're not even going to go back in time because there was part of a national recession, Wisconsin has come out of that much better than a state, for example, like Illinois, where they still have budget problems. They have an unemployment rate that's a couple points higher than we have in Wisconsin. They have real challenges down there because they refuse to make the tough choices. We've made those. We put in place positive reforms. And I think not only if people don't want to go back to the Doyle-Burke days, if they don't want to go back to what we see happening right now in our neighboring Springfield, I'm the better alternative.
You cite Illinois, but your critics, as you know, say we're lagging in job growth, 8 out of 9 Midwestern states. So, yeah, we're doing better than Illinois, but why aren't we doing better than these other states?
Well, again, a lot of that data is looking from the past. You look at more recent numbers, even the last few months, we've had aggressive job growth here in this state. In fact, we saw the trend.
Although the third year was the slowest in the job growth.
But you look at the last couple of months. You look at through April, the numbers in January, February, March, and April of this year, we've had positive results. We've had a rebound when it comes to manufacturing in the state. You look at any number of factors out there, we've been doing exceptionally well. Yeah, we had to make up for some chances. If you look at even how things were stagnant before the recall and how they went up again, there have been a number of challenges we've faced, in part because of external factors out there. But I think in the end, when independents look at the difference and they say, where were we at 4 years ago, where are we at today, and where do we want to be 4 years from now, I think the difference is the policies we saw under Jim Doyle and Mary Burke did not work when it comes to the economy. I think they will work if we continue to build off of them going forward.
Let's continue this conversation. We'll take a break right here. We'll talk about some other issues, school vouchers among them. We'll continue with Governor Scott Walker in just a moment.
Up Front with Mike Gousha, brought to you by American Transmission Company.